It was the kind of summer people dream of, long and hot, the sky a pale blue stretch over the English countryside. The family cottage was the perfect escape, secluded, charming, surrounded by sprawling gardens where we spent our days lounging on the patio, sipping wine and basking in the sun. I was there with my young daughter, her laughter a constant melody, and the rest of our extended family. It was idyllic, a snapshot of happiness that seemed frozen in time, like something out of a novel. But in the house, something was changing. My daughter, drawn to the large, forgotten playroom in the cottage, began spending hours there. She was always talking about imaginary friends, fantastical worlds, things that at first seemed harmless. She told me stories about a witch. Her tone was light, innocent, as though it were all part of her game. But soon, her behavior started to shift. Little things at first, moments where her eyes seemed darker, where her voice carried an unfamiliar sharpness. The air around her felt heavier, colder. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences began. A misplaced toy here, a door that creaked open on its own, shadows that danced in corners where light should have swallowed them. My teenage nephew, once indifferent, became obsessed. He whispered to me in the evenings, telling me he no longer believed it was my daughter in the playroom, but something else, something malevolent. An evil spirit had taken hold, he said, a witch inside her skin. I didn't want to believe it. But there was something in my daughter's eyes that I no longer recognized, something that terrified me. The rest of the family grew fearful too, avoiding her, whispering behind closed doors. My nephew and I began to hatch plans, desperate to rid her of the evil we were convinced had possessed her. I didn't want to leave her, didn't want to abandon my own child to something so dark. And yet, with each failed attempt, I found myself more afraid of her. The mania set in slowly, insidiously. What had begun as concern became a feverish obsession. We conducted rituals, our voices rising in desperate chants as the night deepened around us. We swore we saw things, glimpses of the witch in the flicker of candlelight, felt her presence in the shadows. The house itself seemed to breathe with the spirit's presence. Soon, we were all lost, spiraling deeper into our shared madness, convinced that the only way to save my daughter was to force the spirit out. When her father arrived, it was already too late. He found us frantic, wild-eyed, convinced we had been fighting a battle only we could see. He didn't believe us. Couldn't. He searched the house, his rational mind breaking through the fog of hysteria. And that's when he found it. The carbon monoxide leak, seeping into the air we'd been breathing for days, poisoning our minds. He ordered us out of the house immediately, but I resisted. Even then, I couldn't shake the certainty that what we had seen was real. It was only later, once we were outside, once the cool air hit our lungs, that the truth began to settle in. None of it had been real. There had been no witch, no possession, just the poisonous air warping our minds, driving us mad. But the damage was done. I looked at my daughter, now silent and wide-eyed, her small body trembling with fear. She no longer looked at me with the love and trust she once had. Instead, she saw a monster, a family who had turned on her, terrorized her, convinced of an evil that never existed. As we drove away from the cottage, the sun setting behind us, the car was filled with a suffocating silence. My daughter sat in the back seat, staring out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was petrified of us now, of her own family, and no amount of truth could undo the trauma we had inflicted. The summer, once so golden and perfect, had become a nightmare we could never wake from.